Prince William and Princess Anne were left in absolute tears following a devastating announcement regarding Prince Louis. And those closest to the palace knew that once this raw truth was revealed, the monarchy could never shield itself the same way again. What began as a terrified child's late-night whispers quickly exposed a chilling security breach at the heart of the royal estate, but the terrifying reality of what led to this moment had been locked behind closed doors. Before we step behind the velvet ropes to uncover the unvarnished, heartbreaking truth of a family fighting for its survival, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single update. We are building a dedicated community that explores the raw, untold realities behind history's most famous figures, and it would be a genuine honor to have you on this journey. What the public saw was one thing, but what was actually happening inside the palace was something else entirely. For over a millennium, the British monarchy has survived by weaponizing an absolute unbreakable illusion of flawless perfection. Behind the towering iron gates of Windsor Castle and the meticulously choreographed majesty of public appearances, a ruthless, archaic rule has always governed the royal bloodline, maintaining a stiff upper lip and burying private agony beneath the crushing weight of royal duty. But recently, a highly emotional, unprecedented crisis bypassed the rigid royal press machine and sent an absolute shockwave around the globe. It was not an announcement about a scandalous palace feud or a cancelled international tour. It was a raw, bleeding reality about a terrified little boy. Prince William and Princess Catherine shattered generations of stoic protocol to reveal that their youngest son, Prince Louis, had been removed from all upcoming royal duties after suffering severe fear and anxiety linked to repeated security breaches. Behind his famously cheerful viral public smiles was a child carrying a paralyzing terror he could not vocalize, and two desperate parents who finally realized that protecting him meant tearing down the palace walls. The atmosphere inside the briefing room was suffocatingly cold. Prince William placed the revised royal schedule onto the table and pushed it away with absolute detestation. In the world of the monarchy, royal duties are non-negotiable. They are the lifeblood of the institution's public image, consisting of endless ceremonies, high-profile rehearsals, and massive public engagements. Prince Louis would attend absolutely none of them. The future king made this decision absolute because he realized the horrifying truth. His son was not suffering from a temporary bout of childhood shyness. The young prince was retreating into a psychological fortress because a mysterious intruder had breached the inner sanctum of the estate, leaving the child unable to trust the very architecture of his safety. Princess Anne stood beside her nephew, her presence a silent testament to the gravity of the betrayal. She had personally reviewed the undocumented notes of the child's warnings. Louis had been incredibly precise. He had described the exact same man, the identical chilling voice, and the same paralyzing fear. Yet, senior palace officials had reduced the child's terrifying reality to mere youthful confusion and an overactive imagination. William's voice stayed dangerously low, a calm that carried the threat of a thunderstorm. He looked directly into the eyes of the gathered staff and declared that his son would never again be used as a human shield to protect the palace's public relations reputation. Then the Prince of Wales unleashed the revelation that turned a security failure into a chilling conspiracy. The stranger had not merely approached Louis. He had addressed him using a deeply private, highly classified family nickname. This was a name spoken exclusively within the heavily guarded private residential quarters of the royal family. The breach was no longer just about a physical barrier being crossed. It suggested a fatal leak of information that should never have traveled beyond the family's innermost circle. In the immediate aftermath of the initial encounter, the palace press machine worked aggressively to contain the narrative internally. Staff members labeled the terrifying incident an isolated misunderstanding, offering empty, hollow assurances to William and Catherine that the threat had been permanently neutralized. They were catastrophically wrong. The exact same man returned. He bypassed a heavily controlled, restricted area and actively moved toward Prince Louis a second time, proving with terrifying clarity that the initial security failure had never been contained. William signed the temporary withdrawal order, the sharp scratch of his pen echoing through the silent room. He set it down, raised his eyes, and asked the assembled officials why a 9-year-old child had shown more situational urgency and analytical clarity than an entire team of highly trained security professionals. No one dared to answer. Princess Anne then stepped forward, placing a sealed internal chronology onto the table. It was a documented sequence of heavily edited reports, altered timelines, and intentionally delayed warnings. Anne's voice was sharp as steel as she revealed the truth. The first breach was not the true origin of this failure. The initial report of an unknown male in a restricted zone had been actively amended to a possible misidentification of authorized personnel, intentionally downgrading the threat to a minor irregularity. The real systemic breakdown began the exact moment the institution chose concealment over transparency, leaving a frightened child to doubt his own survival instincts. To truly comprehend how the monarchy allowed a young prince to be left entirely alone in the dark, the narrative must pull back the curtain on the private agony that began consuming the Wales household long before this confrontation took place. To the global public, Prince Louis had always been the symbol of unbridled joy, playful mischief, and infectious energy within a rigid, hyper-controlled monarchy. But behind the closed oak doors of Adelaide Cottage, that familiar, vibrant brightness had begun to systematically vanish. The changes were subtle at first, then deeply alarming. Louis completely stopped entering the palace corridors alone. He became obsessed with security, repeatedly asking his mother if specific doors had been locked twice. Whenever an unfamiliar voice echoed from a neighboring room, the young prince would freeze, turning toward William with a silent, haunting question written across his face. Had the stranger returned? Princess Catherine noticed the psychological shift before anyone else, and she understood its devastating depth. As the youngest child of the future king and queen, Louis's increasing presence at massive national occasions had made his face globally recognizable, but those grand appearances carried a hidden, exhausting price. They placed a young child directly beneath the unforgiving microscope of global public attention, making flawless, absolute protection an absolute necessity. Now, the natural confidence the boy once possessed was entirely replaced by an agonizing, hypervigilant caution. One evening, a moment occurred that made it impossible for Catherine to ignore the danger any longer. Louis stopped abruptly at the threshold of a passage connecting the family's private rooms to an interior courtyard. His small hand locked onto Catherine's with a desperate, crushing grip. He refused to take a single step forward. When the princess knelt down, asking what had frightened him, the young boy stared blankly into the shadows of the doorway before whispering that this was exactly where the man knew his name. William carried a profound, suffocating pain. For weeks, senior security commanders had looked him in the eye and assured him that the perimeter was secure. The prince had desperately wanted to trust the system, believing that his family's sanctuary was impenetrable. Now he was forced to confront a brutal reality. His institutional trust had blinded him to his son's worsening trauma. He replayed the promises he had made to Louis that the stranger could never hurt him. Those promises now felt like an open wound. Louis had done everything right. He had meticulously described the intruder, the distinct tone of his voice, the long dark coat, an unusual heavy ring on his finger, and that terrifyingly intimate use of his private family nickname. Yet, because the system is designed to defend its own perfection, protection staff officially classified the child's account as an anxious, hyperactive recollection rather than a credible security statement. They chose to treat a child's raw evidence as mere psychological confusion. Catherine refused to let the institution erase her son's reality. In her private journals, she documented that every single night, Louis woke up completely terrified, listening to the walls. Every rehearsal he refused to put on his formal attire, and every single hour he asked if the man had been captured while the palace demanded his presence. Her records clearly showed that each sharp decline in his confidence directly followed another unexplained security irregularity. The catalyst that permanently transformed Louis's unease into an absolute living nightmare occurred weeks earlier during a highly classified private rehearsal inside the Windsor estate. It was a closed preparation session designed to allow the royal children to practice their movements ahead of a massive public ceremony. For a narrow, catastrophic window of less than 4 minutes, Prince Louis became separated from his parents. As the young prince walked down a restricted garden passage, accompanied by a junior aide, the stranger stepped out from the shadows. He did not breach the palace with force. He moved with the chilling confidence of someone who belonged there. He crouched down to Louis's eye level, calmly uttered the private family nickname, and claimed that Prince William had personally sent him. Then came the chilling mandate that shattered the child's safety, telling him not to tell the guards. Louis's instincts saved him. Refusing to move a millimeter closer, the young boy spun around, broke into a sprint, and fled back toward the rehearsal room. He immediately relayed every single detail to his father and two protection officers. William instantly ordered a complete lockdown of the corridor. Armed response units sealed the perimeter and searched the sprawling grounds while Louis held onto his father's neck, his small body trembling uncontrollably. But the institutional cover-up began before the search was even concluded. Later that evening, Louis accidentally overheard a senior official speaking in an adjoining room, casually suggesting that the grand excitement of the upcoming ceremony had simply confused the young boy's imagination. The realization hit the young prince like a physical blow. The adults responsible for his life did not believe him. When Princess Anne launched her independent investigation, she discovered the first piece of undeniable technical sabotage within the palace's digital records. The security camera directly overlooking that specific garden passage had suffered a total blackout. For exactly 11 minutes during the encounter, the feed was completely blank. The official log labeled the incident as routine, pre-scheduled hardware maintenance. Yet, when Anne demanded the logbooks, she discovered that no maintenance team had ever been authorized to enter that section of the grounds on that fateful day. The final electronic summary provided to the royal family had been completely sanitized. The original handwritten draft, which explicitly cited an unidentified adult male intruder, had been completely deleted. In its place, the final digital version read that there was a possible misidentification of authorized estate personnel. The immediate threat had been entirely erased from the record without William's knowledge, consent, or approval. By the following morning, William's patience was completely exhausted. Accompanied by Princess Anne, the future king entered the private office of the senior palace security coordinator. He dismissed every single junior aide, locked the heavy oak door himself, and eliminated any chance of bureaucratic escape. William placed the raw, unedited report directly next to the rewritten electronic summary. He looked at the coordinator and delivered a devastating question that cut straight through decades of bureaucratic arrogance. Which of these two documents was designed to protect my son, and which was designed to protect your career? The coordinator attempted to deploy standard, polished bureaucratic language, speaking softly about the institutional need to avoid unnecessary public panic. But William stepped closer, his voice dropping into a freezing whisper, as he demanded the official stop hiding behind cold procedures and use his son's actual name. Princess Anne's restraint officially snapped when the surveillance official attempted to characterize the terrifying encounter as a mere interpretive discrepancy. Anne struck the heavy mahogany table once with her open palm, the sound echoing like a gunshot, declaring that a terrified 9-year-old child running for his life from a stalker was absolutely not open to interpretation. Under the weight of an aggressive interrogation, the coordinator finally collapsed. He admitted that he had received direct verbal instructions to deliberately prevent the security breach from reaching the king's senior household. The justification was that they desperately wanted to ensure that the multi-million-dollar upcoming royal engagements were not destabilized before the intruder could be identified. But the horror did not stop there. William learned that the exact same suspect had been spotted near a private service entrance just days later. Instead of warning the family, officials circulated his image only within a tiny, highly restricted internal team. Their catastrophic silence had granted the intruder a second opportunity to hunt their child. William reached forward, ripped the coordinator's official palace credentials from his lanyard, and slid them across the table to Princess Anne. He suspended the official's access immediately, opened the door, and ordered the waiting royal guards to escort the man off the premises. As the coordinator was led away, he yelled a final desperate defense, claiming that he was merely following orders from someone much higher in the command structure, someone who possessed absolute intimate knowledge of how the stranger had obtained the family's highly classified private nickname. The failure was no longer an issue of a broken lock or a faulty camera, because the threat was living inside the family's protected world. Princess Anne followed the digital access trail deep into the palace's forgotten infrastructure. What she uncovered was a profound indictment of institutional negligence. The intruder had systematically mapped out staff schedules, private family routines, and old visitor credentials. Someone within the administration had allowed highly sensitive protected data to remain entirely exposed, preferring a policy of absolute silence over admitting how incredibly vulnerable the royal household had become. When King Charles was presented with the raw, unedited findings, The monarch sat in absolute, stunned silence. His grandson's terror had been packaged into sterile clinical language simply to preserve the illusion of a stable monarchy. The institution had actively chosen to protect its global image before protecting the life of a frightened child. Charles immediately signed an emergency executive decree establishing absolute parental consent, enforcing an independent security review overseen by outside commanders, and mandating that any minor reported incident bypass internal couriers entirely. The fallout was swift and merciless. The security coordinator was permanently terminated from public service. The staff liaison who had leaked internal data was dismissed, and criminal proceedings were officially initiated. The true victory, however, did not take place within the cold confines of a government briefing room, but rather within the quiet sanctuary of a healing family. Late that evening, Prince William walked into his son's bedroom. Bypassing the royal advisors, the men in gray suits, and the communications managers, he knelt down beside Louis, looking at the small golden ceremonial badge resting on the bedside table, a badge meant for the massive public appearance that had now been permanently wiped from the schedule. William picked up the golden badge, placed it gently into Louis's small hand, and made a sacred unwritten promise that no courtier could ever override. The calendar belongs to the crown, but your life belongs to us. You will return only when you are ready, and not a single day before. For the first time in centuries, the British monarchy chose the child over the calendar. The institution did not emerge from this crisis completely untouched, but it emerged radically corrected. For once, the ancient unyielding crown did not demand that a small child carry its immense crushing burden. Instead, a father and an aunt stood like walls of steel, forcing an empire to carry the burden of the child it had failed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next documentary. As the dust began to settle across the Windsor estate, the profound shockwaves of the crisis continued to reverberate through every tier of the British establishment. The realization that a vulnerable child had been exposed to deliberate institutional negligence forced a heavy, somber reckoning among the senior royals. King Charles, sequestered in his private study late into the night, reviewed the comprehensive investigative logs provided by Princess Anne. Each page exposed a systemic rot where blind obedience to public relations had dangerously eclipsed basic human safety. The monarch recognized that a superficial apology or a temporary reshuffling of personnel would no longer suffice to mend the fractured trust of the family. For decades, the crown had operated under the immutable assumption that its internal machinery was infallible, capable of absorbing any scandal or threat without cracking its polished exterior. Yet, this harrowing ordeal proved that the greatest threat to the modern monarchy was not external criticism or public scrutiny, but rather the cold, unfeeling architecture of its own bureaucracy. Meanwhile, deep within Adelaide Cottage, the emotional climate was slowly beginning to transform from one of paralyzing fear into tentative healing. Prince William and Princess Catherine remained fiercely vigilant, ensuring that their household operated on entirely new terms where protection superseded protocol. Prince Louis spent his afternoons surrounded by family, slowly reclaiming the simple joys of childhood that had been abruptly stolen from him by an invisible, creeping terror. Though the psychological scars of the security breach would take years to fully fade, the unwavering solidarity displayed by his parents and Princess Anne provided an impenetrable emotional shield. William knew that the path ahead would require constant vigilance, especially as whispers began to circulate among palace insiders that the dismissed security coordinator was threatening to expose further administrative cover-ups if he was made a scapegoat for a wider institutional failure. The threat of retaliation loomed heavily over the household, serving as a grim reminder that the forces resisting reform within the palace walls were deeply entrenched and fiercely defensive of their hidden power. Yet, the traditional power dynamics had fundamentally shifted. By directly challenging the entrenched hierarchy and prioritizing a frightened child over the sacred royal calendar, William and Catherine had set a radical new precedent for the future of the House of Windsor. They had demonstrated that the crown's ultimate survival relied not on weaponized perfection or the endless suppression of uncomfortable truths, but on its capacity for genuine accountability and fierce parental protection. As the sun rose over the manicured lawns of the estate, casting long shadows across the ancient stone walls, the royal family stood at a historic crossroads. The illusion of flawless perfection had been permanently shattered, replaced by something far more enduring, a human family willing to tear down an empire to keep their child safe from harm. As news of the unprecedented restructuring inside the royal household slowly began to leak, the story violently broke containment, completely shattering the controlled ecosystem of the palace press office. Within hours, international media outlets seized upon the narrative, transforming a private family crisis into a massive global debate about the safety and archaic priorities of the British monarchy. Television networks abandoned their regular programming to feature rows of somber royal commentators, experts, and investigative journalists trying to decipher how a terrifying security breach involving a young prince could have been systematically concealed by senior bureaucrats. Outside the grand iron gates of Windsor Castle, enormous crowds gathered in tense silence, holding handmade signs and whispering amongst themselves as they tried to process the shocking revelation that the institution had actively chosen to protect its public relations image over the life of a frightened child. Social media platforms erupted into fierce global controversy, with millions of users passionately discussing whether the traditional expectations of royal duty should ever override basic human safety and parental protection. The public explosion placed enormous pressure on the remaining senior royals, who found themselves utterly unprepared to manage a narrative driven by raw public outrage rather than carefully choreographed press releases. Palace communications advisors scrambled frantically behind closed doors, drafting defensive statements that were repeatedly torn up and discarded because they failed to address the core betrayal of trust. Commentators on international television openly questioned the competence of the entire royal security apparatus, pointing out that if the inner sanctum of the estate could be compromised so easily, the fundamental promise of protection that justified the monarchy's existence had completely failed. The public debate quickly expanded beyond a simple security failure, morphing into a profound referendum on the future direction of the crown, and whether the traditional hierarchy was capable of genuine reform. Every newspaper headline and morning talk show dissected the unprecedented courage shown by Prince William and Princess Anne, casting them as fierce protectors who dared to break centuries of rigid protocol to fight an invisible institutional enemy. Yet, amidst the roaring storm of media coverage and public speculation, the palace remained officially silent, refusing to confirm or deny the explosive details of the internal cover-up. This deafening silence only fueled the public frenzy, driving endless theories and forcing royal insiders to leak further fragments of the truth to sympathetic journalists. The institutional machinery that had successfully buried countless scandals over the centuries was suddenly buckling under the weight of its own secrecy, unable to control a narrative sparked by a father's fierce refusal to back down. As international pressure mounted by the hour, it became starkly clear that the monarchy could no longer hide behind its ancient walls or rely on empty procedural assurances to quiet the global outrage. The public had spoken, and they demanded accountability, transparency, and a fundamental reshaping of how the most famous family in the world protected its youngest members from the dark shadows creeping just beyond the palace gates. As the global outrage reached a fever pitch, the ultimate test for the monarchy arrived in the form of a heavily anticipated public appearance, a moment where visual symbolism had to speak louder than any official statement could ever hope to achieve. The venue was a solemn, historic national gathering at Westminster Abbey, an architectural masterpiece that had witnessed centuries of royal triumphs, coronations, and profound national mourning. For weeks, royal reporters and international commentators had frantically debated whether Prince William and Princess Catherine would alter their public schedule or choose to keep their youngest son entirely hidden from the flashing cameras and piercing gaze of the public. The tension outside the ancient stone cathedral was palpable, with thousands of onlookers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the family as their official vehicles pulled up to the grand entrance. Every protocol officer, senior courtier, and media producer held their breath, knowing that the exact walking order, facial expressions, and body language displayed on those steps would be analyzed frame by frame across every television screen on the planet. When the car doors finally opened, the visual narrative that unfolded completely redefined the modern image of the House of Windsor. Prince William stepped out first, his expression carved from stone, radiating an intense protective gravity that immediately commanded the attention of the surrounding crowd. But it was the sight of Princess Catherine following closely behind, gently holding the hand of Prince Louis, that sent a collective gasp through the gathered media pack. The young prince did not wear the rigid, nervous smile of a child forced into performance. nor did he shrink away from the towering pillars and the roaring murmur of the crowd. Instead, his posture was calm, anchored entirely by the physical presence of his parents, who walked on either side of him like an impenetrable human shield. Princess Anne followed immediately behind them, her sharp, unyielding gaze sweeping across the perimeter as if daring anyone in the royal entourage to challenge their unified front. Every step they took along the red carpet was executed with deliberate slowness, transforming a standard ceremonial arrival into a powerful, wordless declaration that the family's internal safety lines had been permanently redrawn. Without a single word being spoken to the press corps, the visual symbolism delivered a devastating indictment of the old institutional guard. The traditional walking order had been subtly modified, placing the child directly between his parents rather than exposing him to the outer flanks where the security breach had previously occurred. As they paused briefly at the great threshold before entering the sanctuary of the abbey, Prince William placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, a small, subtle gesture that communicated volumes to the millions watching at home. It was an unmistakable visual victory for parental protection over cold protocol, proving that the crown could no longer compel children to act as sacrificial lambs for public relations illusions. Commentators live broadcasting the event immediately noted the profound shift, pointing out that the monarchy looked entirely different, humbled, deeply human, and fiercely protective of its own flesh and blood. Yet, even as the heavy oak doors closed behind them, sealing the family inside the sacred cathedral, the underlying tension remained thick in the air, hinting that the true institutional fallout was only just beginning to take root. As the solemn echoes of the gathering inside Westminster Abbey slowly faded away, a profound and heavy silence settled over the entire royal household, marking the beginning of a quiet, irreversible reckoning. The frantic media storms and public debates had temporarily subsided, leaving the institution to face the sobering aftermath of its own near-fatal hubris. For centuries, the House of Windsor had relied on the absolute, unyielding shield of absolute perfection, choosing to sacrifice individual well-being at the altar of public relations and archaic ceremony. Yet, this unprecedented crisis had permanently altered the psychological landscape of the monarchy, proving that the ancient walls of the estate could no longer protect the old guard from the consequences of institutional neglect. The silent corridors of Adelaide Cottage felt remarkably different now, stripped of the heavy, suffocating anxiety that had haunted the family for weeks, replaced instead by the cautious, fragile warmth of genuine healing and reclaimed peace. Prince William and Princess Catherine sat together in the quiet sanctuary of their private home long after the sun had dipped below the horizon, reflecting on the immense cost of the battle they had just fought. They had stared down the formidable machinery of the crown, confronting career bureaucrats and hidden networks of power that valued public image far above human life, and they had fundamentally won. Prince Louis slept soundly down the hall, his small room finally free from the haunting terrors that had once turned every shadow into an enemy, his safety secured by parents who refused to let an empire treat him as a disposable asset. Princess Anne's relentless pursuit of the truth had permanently exposed the deep-seated vulnerabilities within the palace administration, leading to sweeping executive decrees that dismantled the old, opaque systems of secrecy and replaced them with mandatory accountability. The individuals who had chosen concealment over transparency were gone, stripped of their credentials and cast out from the inner circle, leaving behind a stark warning to anyone else who might dare to prioritize protocol over the safety of a child. Yet, the monarchy itself emerged from the ordeal forever changed, carrying the deep structural scars of a system forced to look into its own dark reflection. It had lost its invincible armor of flawless infallibility, but in exchange, it had discovered something far more valuable and enduring, a fragile, hard-fought humanity that resonated deeply with a world tired of hollow royal perfection. The relationships within the senior family had been permanently altered, forging an unbreakable alliance between William, Catherine, and Anne, while drawing a permanent boundary against the cold, unfeeling courtiers who sought to control every aspect of their lives. As the night wrapped its quiet arms around the ancient stone towers of Windsor, the crown stood diminished in its blind authority yet vastly elevated in its moral standing, having finally learned that an empire is only as strong as its willingness to protect the most vulnerable among them. History would forever record this moment not as a scandal that destroyed the throne, but as the night a father and an aunt stood like walls of steel, forcing an ancient crown to finally choose a child over the calendar.